Here you see some images to orient you to the topic that I'll be talking about today, which is reevaluating the era that we typically describe in terms of South Korea's economic, so-called economic miracle or miracle on the Han River. That is a fairly familiar story about how South Korea recovered after after the Korean War and developed itself into the economic powerhouse it is today. We also have stories about either the political oppression of this authoritarian system and the kinds of movements, especially that emerged in the 70s and 80s, led by students and laborers to resist political authoritarianism and also low wages on the part of workers. So those are familiar stories that you probably have encountered in your readings of South Korea in the 60s and 70s. I'd like to tell you a slightly new story, not with not by throwing out the other narratives that we have, but trying to rethink them through the lens of non-normative gender and sexuality. So that is what I will be presenting today, and try to show you how public space, the emergence and development of public space was a very important process that mediated people's different kinds of identities or subjectivities. So on the first slide, you see a couple images. On the left, this is an important tea room that was located in Myeongdong, the area that had been settled by Japanese during the colonial era and was a cultural center. It continued to function that way in the post-1945 era. So I'll be showing you that. In the middle, you can see an image of how not just tea rooms, but also theaters became important spaces, especially where gay men were able to meet one another. So you can see an image, it looks like of an older man interested in this younger man for some kind of encounter or relationship. Yeah, so I was talking about the tea rooms in Myeongdong. This is a second-run movie theater, probably in the Chongno area, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And then this is Itaewon, where many transgender bars were created in close proximity to the American military base. So here you can kind of see some images that deal with different kinds of individuals, different kinds of identities, and different kinds of places. So these are the kinds of topics that I want to talk to you about today. So let me move on and I'll show you some more elements of what I'd like to talk about today. Um, so just to give you an orientation, and I'm not sure if Carolina, you were able to circulate, but I have a map that the students can use. It's called the Gay and Queer Map of Authoritarian-Era Seoul. And what I've tried to do on the map is to kind of just point out the places where people tended to congregate. I like to call these hubs, places where people came in and out of. So this, of course, is the Han River. So this is Gangnam down here, of course. And then north of the river up here, the central part of the city. The red areas here are Itaewon. The purple areas are Chongno. So these are the two really important queer zones that are still quite popular. There are others, of course, that remain. And some of these other ones were popular at one time. So the yellow ones are Myeongdong. This is the Ulchiro area. This is Shindangdong area over here, and some other sort of random places on the side. So what I will be talking about today is a kind of spatial movement from this area around here in Chongno through Ulchiro and then ending up down here in Itaewon. Um, So what I'm going to try to focus on today in the lecture is a difficult topic to address, which is the subcultures of same-sex sexuality and
Boy.
gender variance.
Huh?
Um,
Huh?
can everybody mute their microphones, please? Yeah, thank you. Um, So yes, I'll be talking on this kind of hidden subcultures of same-sex sexuality in gender variance. And I use this term hetero-authoritarianism to try to understand how different subcultures and populations were treated under an authoritarian government during the 60s and 70s. The idea that we only have two sexes, men and women, that male bodies and female bodies should do certain things, should act masculine or act feminine, the idea that men dominate this society, all of these things I think were all embracing. That is to say, they affected everyone, not just minority populations like gay, lesbian, and transgender people. So we should imagine that even though we're talking about minority populations, the kind of forces that were acting on people's bodies and minds were wide-ranging kinds of ways of organizing this particular um, society. So I've primarily used mass-mediated representations. So by that, I just mean um, newspapers, magazines, and other kinds of printed sources that during this era often talked about individuals who were deviant or who were perverted or who um, went off the rails, so to speak. So in addition to these published sources, I've also conducted about 20 oral histories as a way of supplementing weekly publications, and other outside assessments of queerness. So when I say edict assessments of queerness, what I simply mean to say is that during this era, we primarily have texts written by outsiders about people in these marginalized communities. So that could be journalists writing about them, it could be doctors, it could be police officers or judges. So those are all outside views. As you can imagine, those outside views are quite ideological and present a certain point of view. So I tried to supplement those outside views by interviewing the people who, in those publications, were being talked about. And you will hear some important voices of the people who I've interviewed. So I see then public spaces, especially in a place like Seoul, which is rapidly developing and industrializing. These spaces are a kind of stage on which not only to be controlled by hetero-authoritarianism, but also in which they can fashion and refashion themselves into new kinds of people. So the city, its spaces and encounters are really important, I think, in trying to understand the development of different kinds of identities. So these are some terms that emerged mostly through the oral histories. And again, you don't see the term so much being used by outsiders to talk about the insiders themselves. So I just give you some of them, and we can talk about them, and you'll see how they are incorporated into the rest of the presentation. The term kisuni, you may know ki is one word, and then suni is a kind of person. You can still hear this term used today. It typically means something like an effeminate gay man. So I've used the term fairy in English as a way to try to capture what the term gisuni meant. Then you have another term that emerged through the interviews that I did, and I call this in English makeup queen. You may have heard of the expression in Korean, dokji hada. Um, so from that onomatopoeia was created this term called dodok. And this is really, you could call it a cross-dressed performer, typically a male-born person who performs feminine or female roles. And for what we might today call transgender, this is important because dokji, the onomatopoeia suggests applying something on your face. So what this meant was applying makeup to cover your facial hair on your face. So you can see that it's not really a term for all transgender people, but it has specific connotation to the professional category of being a feminine presenting entertainer. Um, we also have the term gay, which today, if we said gay, you might assume a homosexual man, but gay is probably better translated as transgender or gender non-conforming. Um, and gay, although it's an English word, it was borrowed from Japan during the 1980s, which suggests that these terms also had close connections to the various racial or international actors that came in and out of Korea at this time. So there were many Japanese travelers and tourists who came to Korea in the 1980s, and Korean transgender culture was very much influenced by Japan. And so the term gay then comes to us from English via Japan and then to Korea. The other term that often appears during this period is the term 보갈. I've translated that into English as fag. It literally means a homosexual man. And interestingly, it's a reversal of the vulgar term for a low-class sex worker in Korea, a prostitute, which is named kalbo. And so gay men have converted this term and turned it on its head. I think this is partly because it was a way of um, telling society that they had to live a life that was like a sex worker, keeping them in dark spaces and marginalizing them. And I think it was also a way for them to be able to use a word in public to talk about themselves, but use a word that's flipped around. And so mainstream listeners couldn't really understand what the term meant. So it was a way to, in a sense, be in a public space, but remain under the radar of being criticized. So the term that would have been used more popularly as an outsider term looking in onto gay men would have been the term homo, which is very derogatory. So instead of using that term, they use their own subcultural term, um, pogar. And then this had various varieties or versions. So a Korean man who preferred white partners was called a Yangbogar. Yang simply means Western. Some of these people eventually moved overseas. And then there were other versions like Webogar, which referred to Korean men who dated Japanese men. So you can see that the terms also developed in the context of Korea's transnationality and interracial relations with the outside world. So a few points that I'll try to make today is um, to talk about queerness is obviously what we would today call gay and lesbian, gender and sexual minorities were, of course, marginalized. But what's interesting is the queer communities themselves developed within mainstream institutions and in public sites. So rather than necessarily being um, relegated to some place that was outside of the society or far away from the center, queer people navigated and maneuvered within mainstream institutions and public spaces. So in the presentation and in my research on this topic, I used the word shadow readers. So people who um, were being written about in popular publications. They were largely directed not at queer people, but at mainstream individuals. They were quite negative in their tone. But as a shadow reader, someone who picks up those materials and uses them as a kind of guide. That term is very useful to try to understand how even mainstream institutions and publications could spawn new kinds of queer communities. So whether you were a shadow reader of mainstream publications, whether you simply passed by a movie theater or a tea house, um, or whether you were a newcomer maybe from the countryside coming into Seoul, you could reappropriate, reclaim different spaces that were not set up for you, but you could turn into your own spaces. So this included, as I mentioned, tea houses, second-run theaters, bars, and also clubs. And these hubs, as I showed you in the slide of the map, were scattered around Myeongdong. Kwangyo is near Cheonggyecheon in the middle of the city. Myeongyundong is near Seonggyungwan University. Ulchiro, um, which is close to Myeongdong, was a theater district, as well as Cheongno and Itaewon. And of course, these are only places within the city of Seoul. So you had similar kind of hangouts in other large cities, such as Busan, Gwangju, Daegu, and other places as well. So the story that I want to tell you then, having sort of set up both the importance of public space, the geography of Seoul, as well as the emergence of these terms, is to try to show you one story, one queer story of many that we could tell that talks about the migration of these effeminate gay men who meet in the area around Cheongno and Ulchiro. This happens in the 1970s. And then how some of the members of the queer community um, discovered, yes, as male-born people, they were attracted to men, but rather than being pogar, rather than being fairies, they considered themselves gender non-conforming or transgender. So I'll try to show you how these people originally congregate and work in Cheongno in Ulchiro, and then finally move to Itaewon, and sometimes even move to Japan in order to create their own subcultural community of transgender people. So this is not only a spatial move from Cheongno and Ulchiro to Itaewon and by extension to Japan, but it's also um, a way of moving from different kinds of gender and sexual identity categories like pogal, which is a kind of sexual category. I'm a male-born person who is attracted to other men. That's a sexual category. To a gender-based category, which is the makeup queen, the dodok, the person who covers their face. Um, and also, dodok, as I mentioned, is a kind of professional category. So I'm tracing the move from one space to the other and also tracing the transformation of gender identity or sexual identity from pogar, from a homosexual man or a fag, to a makeup queen and a professional worker. Um, I'll skip this point because I'll mention it um, earlier, later. So becoming a makeup queen or becoming a transgender person, again, gay was the term that was used more generally during the 1980s. I will also try to show you involved life-threatening medical procedures. This was because before the 1990s, it was impossible for transgender women to receive biomedical treatments in Korea and to legally transition. So they often resorted to quack doctors, like unlicensed doctors who would perform certain very risky surgeries, like being castrated. And before the 1990s, it was quite easy to go to a pharmacy and to purchase hormones. So this is a kind of black market industry where transgender women were, in a sense, left outside of biomedical modernity and instead resorted to these risky and dangerous procedures. And in doing so, they created new mechanisms of survival, family-like communities, and created bonds of intimacy that emerged outside of the possibility of visiting large university hospitals. Those identities largely emerged outside of biological kinship. That is to say, the family that you were born into, often the transgender women were excluded from those communities, were thrown out of their families. So they built new institutions outside of mainstream institutions. But on the other hand, we should imagine that um, uh, even transgender community was not fully separated from other marginalized communities. So I'll show you that when the makeup queens begin to work in Itaewon, they're working in close association with gay men who create the clubs in which they work. So transgender and gay are very closely associated, have lots of overlaps, and there are some efforts to try to distinguish the two or to have one group separate from the other, but the two groups often had very close kinds of relationships. And I guess one of the historical significance of this particular history that I'd like to point out is that today in South Korea, LGBT identities are often very fragmented and separated. And it's quite difficult to interact with many of these subgroups. So by revisiting history, I think we're able to see some of the kinds of connections that linked different kinds of gender and sexual minorities. So I see these kind of past practices or micro practices of belonging um, as a kind of way in which they offer us resources for today's sexual minorities, which tend to be, as I mentioned, highly individualized and fragmented, and often seeking greater inclusion. So let me just set the stage then for you by creating some context, social context and spatial context for the larger story I want to tell you about the relationship between gender and sexual identity, um, space, and movement between spaces. So let me begin by introducing to you the movement from Myeongdong to Cheongno. So this is not included in the title, but I just would like to show you some slides to give you a sense of where this community was anchored and how it developed. So this is an important source. This was a magazine article published in 1965, one of the first exposés about Seoul's gay community. A couple of things to note. On the right side, you can see the importance of tea rooms. So you can see two men being served by a tea server. Tea rooms were largely a kind of heterosexual space. So normally it would be, the dynamic would be the men would be interested in a female date or in a female server, but here the tea room is being reappropriated and being used by gay men. The other site that was often mentioned, and you can see it as well in the expose, is the importance of third-rate theaters, where people would stand in the back of the theater and hunt for individuals. So the expose is important in showing us not just the importance of different spaces, so you can see parks, theaters, tea rooms, but also the different kinds of individuals who participated in this system, their occupations, their classes. So this is a quite interesting expose that gives us a sense of the emergence and development of this community. The community, the gay community, and the transgender woman community developed largely in the context of post-colonialism. So this is the area around Myeongdong. So this is City Hall over here, Myeongdong around here. And the expose that I just showed you from 1965 mentions a number of different theaters. In the publications, they would often just give the first letter of the theater and not the whole name. I suppose that was trying to, in a sense, anonymize it. But if you were a reader, of these accounts, a shadow reader. So even though in the 1965 report, gays are being criticized, these reports are also providing a kind of guide to these shadow readers who, if they pick up the publication and they see the D Theater in Myeongdong, they would know that this is the Donghwa Theater inside what is today the Lotte Plaza. At the time, it was called the Midopa Department Store. Um, Formerly, it was called the Donghua Department Store. And here you can see a picture of the building, the location right here on the right. And department stores often in the past had movie theaters. So up on the top floor, there was a movie theater and then a commercial space. So this was extremely common. Um, and another reminder that queer subcultures insinuate themselves or they develop within mainstream institutions and commercial spaces like this one. The expose also mentions a M theater, which was the old Mielman department store. You can see an image of it here on the left and a picture of it here from a film. This was also located in the Myeongdong area and was a popular space for older gay men to meet. Over time, this community, um, which develops in and around Myeongdong during the 1950s and 60s, shifts slightly north up to Chongno. So there's another department store, formerly the Hwashin department store, which is along Chongno, which also used to be a popular place for gay men to cruise. So here you can see a map of the Chongno area. This is Gyeongbok Palace over here. This is Kyobo bookstore over here. And right next to Chonggak Station, there used to be this department store. It was built in 1940, destroyed in the Korean War, and rebuilt in 1957, and becomes a student theater in 1967. Here you can see some students in uniforms walking around the department store, and it also, in the 60s and 70s, becomes a place where gay men tend to congregate. So I'll just give you one sample from one of the oral histories that I did. I've anonymized all of the individuals in the presentation, most of them to protect their privacy. So a man that I'm calling Mr. C, he was born in 1949, so just a year after South Korea was established. So in the late 1960s, he was a college student. And he told me how in 1968, at the age of 19, he went to visit Shimji Tea Room. This is the image that I showed you on the first slide as a college student. And at Shimji, he met a number of male fashion designers. Um, so going back to this image, you can imagine these two men maybe were fashion designers, hung out at the Shimji Theater, and created a kind of community of male fashion designers um, who associated themselves with other gay men. And it was here at Shimji where Mr. C overheard stories about the Hwashin Theater. And so, in addition to visiting Myeongdong, he goes to the Hwashin Theater and has his first experience in one of these cruising theaters. So here you can see some images of the development of second run theaters. So South Korea had first run theaters and second run theaters. The first run theaters would show the newest movies, often more high quality movies, foreign films, and then you would buy one ticket to watch one screening, and then you would leave the theater. But at a second run theater, you could buy one ticket and you could hang out the entire day. So, as we will see, the movie theaters emerge as an important site at which gay men meet each one another. So here you can see one of these weekly reports. It says that there's a homosexual frenzy happening in Korea. This is from 1975. This is Pada Theater and Chonil Theater, so two competing second-run theaters. And what's interesting about these reports is that we also begin to see how Koreans are interacting not only with themselves, but also with non-Korean, either residents or tourists who come to the country. So the 1975 expose mentions a Korean who is dating a Japanese man. And then if you look at Japanese publications from the same period, in Korea, you don't have any gay-specific magazines in the 60s and 70s, but in Japan, you do. Japan has a slightly more developed print culture. Um, for LGBT people. And here we can see on the left side some snippets from those publications that says that if you walk along Seoul's Chongno area, you can go to the Hwashin Theater, and there's lots of people there. There's many, many students, and many of the students speak Japanese, so it's easy for a Japanese man to meet a Korean partner. And similarly over here along Korea or Seoul's Chungno Street, there are many theaters and there's a lot of students that you can meet and you can hunt for. So these publications are from Adonis Boy and Adon from the 1970s and give you a sense of the way in which this subculture was emerging uh, vis-a-vis Japan and also the United States. And I should mention Europeans. So you are seeing on the left side a snippet from the gay magazine Spartacus, which was published in Amsterdam, and was, if you were a gay man living in the United States or living in Europe or living elsewhere and you were traveling overseas, these days we have the internet, we have social media, we have Tinder, Grindr, lots of ways to meet people. But at that time, everything was printed. So gay men would pick up Spartacus, and if they traveled to, let's say, Korea, they'd open up to the page about Korea. Um, you can't trust everything that you read in these publications, but it's interesting that it says every hotel room boy or bellboy in Korea is a pimp. So one should not be bashful about asking them for advice, especially if you don't mind paying. So um, one of the important hotels where gay men tended to meet in Myeongdong was the Savoy Hotel. In the basement, there was this bar that was frequently a place where foreign tourists could meet locals, maybe through the matchmaking of bellboys or even some of those fashion designers in Myeongdong had expansive networks, and they would use those networks to introduce foreigners to Koreans. As I mentioned, I'm primarily talking about Seoul, but here again is another snippet from one of those Japanese publications. And here it's talking about Busan, that if you ask a bellboy at a Busan hotel, they will gladly introduce you to other men. So there probably was some truth to this statement in Spartacus that at least some bellboys in some hotels were functioning in this kind of matchmaking way. So going back to the movement of gay subcultures from Myeongdong to Cheongno, this was the most important theater, probably the most famous gay cruising theater in Korea. It's gone today. But if you go to the area right next to Pagoda Park in Seoul, you will find what was originally called the Nagwon Theater in Nagwon-dong, established in 1960. The name of it changed in 1966 to the Pagoda Theater. So here is a snippet from one of the other interviews I did with a man also who came of age in the 60s and 70s. He was born in 1960. And he told me this. He said, we were there at the theater, Pagoda Theater, enjoying a movie when we noticed that others were standing in the back near the projection room. Even though there were lots of empty seats, I wondered why, and to my surprise, they were having sex. They were in the back behind the projection booth kissing in the dark, except it was not that dark. The back of the theater was structured such that there was enough space to stand underneath the projection booth. I sneaked a glance at them and saw them kissing, blowing each other and having anal sex. I was so shocked. But at that exact moment, I discovered a new wondrous world. That place lingered in my head, provoking sensual thoughts even when I was studying in college. And since then, I could not stop thinking about Pagoda Theater in Chongno. I had some time to spare before I returned to college after being released from military service, so I learned more about Pagoda and the world famous gay bars that grace the area. Once I discovered Chongno, I lost interest in everything else. Chongno was a sight to behold. So you can see how it's just a simple visit to this place and encountering a subculture with which this person was unfamiliar was a kind of life-changing experience. And we can find similar kinds of information, not just from oral interviews, but also from various kinds of archives. So here is an example. This is the cover of the weekly that contained that story about the homosexual frenzy happening in Seoul, and a similar report from 1972, also describing gay subcultures. Um, Here you can see the importance again of the tea room. Um, and in the red highlight, you can see what is typical. So this H theater, so this was the Hwashin Theater. The P theater was Pagoda Theater. The K theater in Taegero, this is Gukdong Theater. The Y theater, this is Yongsan Theater in Yongsan. So again, for gay men who have very few ways of meeting one another, even these exploitative kinds of publications provided a kind of guide to find one another. One interesting thing I'll point out about this particular text that is worth noting is this term here. So here we see the term pogar, which, as I mentioned earlier, was largely an insider category, not used by outsiders to describe gay men. So this is quite interesting. It either suggests that pogar has moved outside of the subculture into the mainstream, or perhaps this is my more likely assumption that some of these authors themselves may have been gay and had access to the terms themselves. So it may be the case that this particular author was aware of the term and used it in the expose. So now having set up the kind of background to the talk, I just want to give you the more specific story about different kinds of queer people. So we talked about fairies, we've talked about makeup queens, fags, potato queens, and others. So I want to tell you the story of one individual who was a kind of gender non-conforming fairy among various Chongno fags or pogar. And this is an individual named Sekja. And unlike most of the interviewees who I was able to speak to, Sekja told me that not only did she not want her name anonymized, but she thought that she preferred to have her story told. So when I interviewed her in 2021, she said, "Of course, I don't mind you use my name. I don't mind at all because I have not done anything wrong. I have never lied or swindled. I'm proud of my life. It had its ups and downs, but it is like that for everyone. Even if I use a pseudonym, a nickname, people will know it is me and will disparage me for hiding my identity. Tell them it is me, Sekja. It is Sekja's story." So this is the person whose life history we will explore in the remainder of the course to talk about this transition of encountering a gay world in Chongno, moving through Ulchiro, and ending up in Itaewon. So here are some of the other transgender women that I was able to meet throughout my study. And I like to use this term, I borrow it from another scholar, queer fugitivity, to describe how queer people were often um, alienated by family, in the school, and by community members. And so they became runaways, they became fugitives within their own country. So typically we think of a fugitive or an exile as someone who leaves their society or maybe goes to another country. Here I want you to try to think of queer people as internal exiles or internal fugitives. So when I began the interview talking to Sekta, she said to me, "We don't have," giving a sense about how her experience growing up in a sex segregated society being a man and having to wear a masculine or male uniform was a source of pain for someone like Sekja. Others around Sekja, like Mrs. N, who was born in 1958, told me that from a young age I was bullied at school, and growing up like that is as an effeminate man, I became very introverted. And these are very common stories that you hear from transgender people who grew up during this very difficult era. Miss C, yet another contemporary of Sekja, conveyed to me similar sentiments about her own childhood, revealing in heartbreaking terms that her older brothers beat her when she put on her mother's Korean dresses and tied decorative cloths around her head. This queer presentation led to constant fighting with Mrs. C's parents, especially her mother. And so, like Sekja and her other fairy friends, Mrs. C also ran away from home as a teenager, inspired by those media reports that I just showed you about Pagoda Theater, and using those accounts to find other people like themselves. So this is Sekja, a picture of her that I found from 1982. Gives you a sense of maybe what they look like at that time, and the kind of self-fashioning that took place. You can see long nails and also long hair. And Sakja told me that how important Pagoda Theater was for her. She said that she went there by pure accident, and had this encounter where this random man started touching my body. She said the people there were giving each other strange looks. They were all standing in the back of the theater, coming and going. So I intuitively understood that this was a place for my kind of people, whether that meant gay or transgender. That was still in the making. She said, we went to Pagoda Theater very often. From there, we slept with whomever we liked. Because we were young, older men would pay us for sex. We used that money to pay our rent and to buy food. So that was the beginning of my life in Chongno, she told me. She said, my friend and I were living at an inn at a hotel in the Chongno area. So we bought some clothes at a local market, 16-inch bell bottoms. We put them on and flaunted our hair as we strutted along Chongno. Most guys at the time wore blouses, which was a bit boring. Well, not me. I put bra pads inside to make my breasts look fuller. Together with the bell bottoms, they had just the right amount of feminine flair. That is how I grew up. I was about 19 or 20 at the time. Pagoda and the neighboring pubs were our hideouts. So you can see how Chongno is not a purely queer space or gay space, but within the larger Chungno area, you begin to see how queer people are poaching or using those spaces in order to create their own communities. Later, Sekja will move away from Chongno, largely populated by gay men. Of course, she was attracted to other men, but she did not find her gender to be normative, did not want to present in a masculine way, and so began to move away from Chongno, first to Ulchiro, an area in between Chongno and Itaewon. So here we can see an image of one of those media reports from the mid 1970s, describing the emergence of gay bars. Probably some of the first gay bars emerge in the Uchiro area. One of them, an important one, was called Adam. So one of my interviewees, a gay man born in 1958, said, the funny thing about Adam and other Urchiro bars is that they used a sarangbang system reminiscent of olden days in Korea. So in that small room, the young employees, people like Sekja who worked at the bars, would play cards until they fell asleep like knives on top of one another, as if they lived in a dormitory. In the morning, the owner asked employees to make breakfast, which everyone shared together. He even allowed customers who could not make it home at night. Remember that there was a midnight curfew in South Korea up until the early 1980s, and so they often would stay in the bar. So all of the bars in the Uchido area function in this kind of similar way. So you get a sense of the kind of camaraderie, community that was being created um, in and around the bars. Adam was especially important as a site where Korean men who were attracted to non-Korean men could meet one another. So some of the interviewees who I spoke to, I've covered their faces because I don't want you to see exactly who they are. But they told me some very important stories about how they met at this bar, Adam. Here you can see some snippets from that international European based gay magazine, Spartacus, which actually shows us exactly where Adam was located, right behind the Myeongbo Theater. So notice how many of the gay bars emerge in and around theater areas. So this was one of the places where if you were Korean and you wanted to meet a foreign man, you could go. So Sekta told me that she worked at one of these gay bars. It was called Han. So through the Spartacus Gay Guides, I have been able to locate exactly where some of these bars used to be. So here is the place from a couple of years ago. I took a picture, and using the addresses, we found out that if you go up these stairs, you can find gay bar. So this was a printing district in the Uchido area that was making tickets and calendars, often catering to the nearby theaters. So on the first floor, you had printing shops. And then on the upstairs area, you had a lot of service industry places, including bars. So you can see a list of some of these bars. And Sekcha told me, she said, of course, the gay men at that time preferred those with a heterosexual man-like style. Most gay folks have the hearts of women inside, so they prefer people who are different. But the guys working at the bar were all masculine types, so the customers were naturally attracted to them. And yet she herself wasn't quite like that. She was an emerging transgender woman, and so found this environment a little bit stifling. So she moves from Hanmaum, one of these Urchiro gay bars, to another bar in close close by, um, that was called Hwawan or Flower Garden. And it was here where she began to perform in drag. She said the customers of this new bar, Hwawan, did not come to meet men. They were there to see men wearing dresses and makeup. They were there for the show, and they did not like men who dressed in men's attires. They were there to enjoy the company of men in makeup. So it was here in Ulchiro that Sekja is beginning to transition away from her life as a pogar, as a fag in the Chongno area, and move closer and closer to a life of being a gender non-conforming woman, and drag plays an important part in that process. So she moves from first meets people like her in Chongno, begins to wear effeminate clothing, moves to Uchiro and starts to work in bars, begins to perform in drag. And then really she finds her home in the 1980s when a number of quote unquote gay bars emerge in Itaewon. And remember again that gay here does not mean homosexual man, but means something more like transgender woman. So I'll describe to you two paths of how Itaewon becomes a kind of site of transgender bars. So the first thing to understand is the place of fashion designers and the role of Myeongdong. So let's go back to Myeongdong just for a minute and explain. So the Myeongdong area was an important cultural center. It was a place where there were a lot of small tailor shops and fashion stores, and it was here where a number of gay men get their start by designing clothes. So this is some images of one important person who, as you can see on the right, opens a gay bar in Itaewon, a transgender bar, but gets his start in Myeongdong. So here you can see some pictures of when he went to school, wearing, of course, a male school uniform, here dressed in a suit, He worked in a tailor shop, and then later opens a transgender bar. So he said in a published account from 1987, no matter how feminine I was, I have never possessed a woman's body. Thus, designing clothes for them was fantastic. Those fantastic ideas gave pleasure to women. Women become sensitive when they have to work closely with other women or with men, but they were comfortable interacting with me. I assume it was because I was more of an awkward, feminine-hearted man. So this particular individual establishes a small bar, first in the Myeongdong area, and then opens a transgender bar in Itaewon. So here you can see an image of one of the first transgender performers, not still yet in Itaewon. This person was famous for singing and dancing, especially the flamenco, in drag at a bar close to Itaewon in Kumodong in 1977. We'll see that 1980 is really going to be the starting point of transgender bars in the Itaewon area. Um, a similar trajectory we can see in the figure of Lee Hee-jin. He's actually just passed last year. And he also gave me permission to use these images and to show his face. He's a very interesting figure in South Korean history. He was also a fashion designer, so you can see an image of him in the 1970s. Here is an image of him when he served in the military. Later in the 1980s, he becomes something like of a gay capitalist, opening many transgender bars and restaurants in Itaewon, and then has this kind of transformation and leads the so-called ex-gay movement, which is trying to use Christianity to pray away your gayness. So this is in his printed autobiography. He said that in the army, I was able to have sex with whomever I wanted. No one rejected my seductions. It was not a matter of where they took place, whether in the toilet stall, shower, squad room, or even the sentry barracks. Regardless of one's position or rank, once seduced, it was impossible for them to resist and fall for my bait. So it gives you a sense of how the military, often imagined as an institution of power and conformity, was also a place in which same-sex relationships were emerging. And then later, talking about his fashion designer days, he said, my mind was elsewhere, so there's no way I could build my business. And soon enough, I depleted my mother's hard-earned money. I also borrowed money from lenders and could not pay them back on time, which led to spending nights in custody in jail. My first business attempt closed after 3 years of operation. So it gives a sense of his struggles to try to find a place for himself in the world as a gay man in the competitive world of fashion designing, loses all of his money, and then eventually recreates his life in Itaewon as a kind of gay capitalist, borrowing money from individuals to get his businesses off the ground, but taking advantage of the interest in transgender life, not only among Koreans, but also among tourists, especially from Japan. So here you can see his English name is Jonah Lee. In addition to a discotheque that he opened in 1986, he also opened this transgender club. So this is Jonah Lee here, dressed in a dress. Next to him, this is Sekja, who I'll return to in a minute. And also, I show you that he managed this restaurant. It's probably no coincidence that it was Japanese because many tourists were coming from Japan. He eventually closes his businesses and moves to Japan in the late 1980s around the time of the Olympics. So the 1980s really emerge as a kind of era of a transgender boom and the emergence of these gay bars. So in addition to the gay capitalists moving from Myeongdong and taking their talents in fashion design, also their connections to theater and dance and music to create the gay bar scene, they're also taking off the streets or out of these gay bars, individuals who identified more as women, and the transgender bar gave them a place to work and a community in which to participate. So here you can see um, a group of these transgender women who created these quite elaborate, they were called package shows, where they would perform different kinds of dancing and music, adopted from New York's Radio City Rackettes, Paris's Lido Cabaret, Brazilian samba, and topless shows that were reminiscent of the MGM Club in Las Vegas. So here again, you can see a picture of some of these shows. You can see in the background, it says Yore, Cafe Crazy Love, which was one of the first transgender bars. And you can see on stage, Sekja performing for her customers. So the gay bars of Itaewon, the transgender bars, to be more specific, were important in providing a space to work and also offering a community. So you can see in some of these images also that were published, the makeup queens, as they were called, of the 1980s, getting ready for work, shopping together, and creating a new kind of family as queer fugitives separated from their biological families and their own communities. Now, we should imagine that the emergence of these transgender bars is also taking place, excuse me, at the same time that the world is experiencing the HIV/AIDS crisis of the mid to late 1980s. So just as this subculture is beginning to emerge, we're beginning to see another challenge, which is this worldwide epidemic. So Sekta told me about the 1980s and moving to Itaewon. She said, I felt that the times were changing and I was relieved to finally do the work that I always wanted to pursue. I was part of that community. This is where I belonged. And just like the bars in Uchiro, speaking of the transgender bars in Itaewon, she said, we lived there. We took turns cooking. We were like a sorority living in a dorm together. And yet at the same time, as I mentioned, the HIV/AIDS crisis was beginning. So when I interviewed Jonah Lee, who opened Cafe Crazy Love, he said to me, South Korean society considered these so-called female-dressed men or transgender women as beasts. When the AIDS crisis became a social issue in the 1980s, they were even evicted from their homes. They were also rejected at restaurants. In response, I purchased a 1,700 square foot apartment in Itaewon. Since it was the apartment complex where only foreigners resided, 20 of my employees could live there safely. That was the situation of transgender people at that time. We should also remember that although there were few legal mechanisms to criminalize or to punish queer people. Largely, they were controlled through social norms and social discrimination. The misdemeanor punishment law was occasionally used to crack down on male-born people who identified as women. So Sekja told me, she said, instead of taking us to the police station, those idiots, the police officers, visited an amusement park. They cooled their feet in water and ate chickens while we gasped for breath in the sweltering heat for hours. It was horrible, a complete violation of human rights. And this system also became quite institutionalized, such so that Sekta told me that the police would come to my bar once a year to detain two people. It was just a formality, but when someone reported us, maybe a customer or others who saw men, male-born people presenting as women, the police were forced to comply. And so we spent several days in lockup in the prison. Each time they came, we decided which two girls would go and be imprisoned. That's how they detained two girls from each of the club. And then they would go to a summary trial. And Sekja said to me, During the trial, the judge did not even know what the actual charge was, so he had to refer to a dictionary. And guess what he found? Crime for indecent dressing. Can you believe that? Um, and then I asked her, well, didn't you protest that this was somehow indecent? And she said, well, if I would have protested, they would have added 2 extra days for insubordination. I had to plead guilty and stay put. If I would have resisted, they would have locked me up for more than 3 days, 5 days, or maybe even a whole week. So although um, makeup queens, transgender people working in and out of these bars around Itaewon were marginalized and were occasionally um, put in jail simply for presenting in the way they wished. They did develop their own sense of politics, not the kind of politics we might imagine where they protest against the state or demand things from the state. Of course, the 1980s, South Korea was still under military dictatorship. Students and laborers were fighting for their rights, but the idea that transgender people could do that in a public way and gain some kind of benefits or privileges was still extremely difficult. And yet, nonetheless, they waged important public relations campaigns and used the mass media in order to make statements about being protected by the state and being socially recognized. So on the right side, you see one of the transgender bar workers who is actually visiting a nursing home and doing a show for the elderly. One person said in 1985, even though we transgender people live among pointed fingers and contempt, I honestly want to contribute and help society if circumstances allow, because we have artistic talents. I hope to console the elderly in nursing homes and put on stage performances for the young at orphanages. I also have a desire to visit detention centers and volunteer for those there who appreciate and understand us. Until now, it has been difficult for us to survive while avoiding discrimination from others, but from today, we want to live as human beings. So here you can see not only an emerging sense of politics, but also the way in which these individuals are linking their position to other kinds of marginalized people in Korea, either the elderly, people who are orphans, or people who are at detention centers for having um, made some kind of wrong decision or being criminalized simply for being who they were. This is returning to Jonah Lee, who in March 1986 made a similar kind of statement from his position as a bar owner and the leader of a transgender community. So he said, in the US, one mayor has emerged with gay liberation as an election pledge. Even if one cannot hope for such a thing, it would be good for South Korea to guarantee our right of survival. I must establish a barrier to protect the people who work with me. So you may be familiar with the island in southern Korea, Sorok Island, which was created during the colonial period for patients suffering from Hansen's disease. So Jonah Lee is saying there's a place like that in Korea. So maybe Itaewon needs to be created as a similar kind of bastion to protect transgender people. And then another transgender bar worker writing in the mass media in 1984 said, the state protects the mentally weak who would die if they were left alone and offers a monopoly on the massage profession to the blind because they cannot see. So this is a reference to Park Jong-hee providing people who are visually impaired with a profession, which is to become a massage professional. But in the case of we pitiful transgender people, why doesn't the government provide us a similar foundation for life instead of rejecting us as decadent for simply trying to survive by dancing? So these are just some of the kind of samples you can see to understand the development and emergence of a kind of informal or uninstitutionalized politics that is developing among this community as it is anchored in Itaewon. And then the last thing I'd like to mention, and which I've already mentioned before, is that without the ability to really rely on the state or Korean society for protection or support, the best way for transgender women to ensure their personal happiness and economic livelihood was to medically transition. So this was a process of self-feminization, but which largely took place outside of biomedical modernity. And by this, I simply mean that transgender people could not go to hospitals and see experts who could provide for their medical care. So that might have included hormone replacement therapy, gender affirming surgeries, none of which really existed in Korea until the late 1980s. So Sekta told me how she engaged in this kind of self-feminization process by buying estrogen shots at local pharmacies. So she said, my breasts are not fake. I took depilumab shots, estrogen shots, and my breasts grew to be this big. They usually do not become this big with hormone shots alone. Mine are quite large for being natural. I achieved this result from hormone therapy alone. And another very disturbing account, but I think important one to remember, just how far transgender women were willing to go to transform themselves. Sekja said to me, we had surgery in a motel room without general anesthesia, even though one should be completely sedated for the procedure. We only had local anesthesia when we did it. That is how desperate we were to become women, to rid ourselves of this nuisance attached to our body, here referring to their penises. Think about it. It was not a hospital with proper facilities. There we laid in a motel room with an IV stuck in our arms, only partially anesthetized. Although there was no guarantee of even surviving, we did it anyway. We all did it. I was not afraid of the pain because all I ever wanted was to be a woman and to look like one, to have feminine features. So I never gave it a second thought. I wanted to change. So let me just quickly conclude, and then we can open it up for some answers, questions and answers. Um, so what I'd like to suggest in the conclusion is um, to try to move from today's situation of LGBT rights in Korea, which where people are still struggling in order to become recognized and to live a decent and honorable life. Um, so although South Korea has moved from authoritarianism or hetero-authoritarianism to democracy, or at least what we thought was a democracy before the declaration of martial law last year, um, we also have in South Korea the situation of increasingly individualized politics. People identify as one thing, enjoy one thing, consume another thing, and in many senses have lot more freedoms than, let's say, someone like Sekja or the men I described who moved in and out of shadowy theaters. And yet, one of the other effects of the post-democratic era and the era of neoliberal consumption and capitalism is a kind of fragmentation or atomization of various communities that in the past, in the era that I talked to you about, had much more close connections to one another. So I'm hoping that the research can offer a way to move away from an individualized politics of despair and move towards a broader and more inclusive community in which we can recognize differences within our community and connections across different generations. So I think we can conclude by saying that Seoul's spaces of entertainment, and if we looked at other locations, we might find similar patterns in other cities. These spaces of entertainment were vital and generative meeting grounds for various queer individuals and their collective subcultures. So they appropriated places where people met, contact zones, to insert themselves into public life. As shadow readers, people who picked up those derogatory magazines and use them in order to find one another, and also became shadow users. So second run or B theaters were not created for gay, transgender, and other queer individuals, but nonetheless, they were able to use those heterosexual sites in order to forge their own communities. Um, some of these places not only forged communities in Korea, but also outside of Korea. So some of the so-called potato queens, the Koreans who were attracted to white gay men, many of them left in the 1980s, some of them to Europe. Several of the people that I interviewed for this presentation married white men in places like Amsterdam or Germany, and still maintain the kind of communities that they had in Korea. These days, not through word of mouth per se, but through social media and apps like Kakao Talk. Um, so I also tried to describe how people who were once identified or identified themselves as fairies, as effeminate gay men, um, they moved away from Cheongno and towards Itaewon. And many of them still live and work in Itaewon in transgender bars. So Sekja, who I introduced to you today, interestingly moved to Japan and lived there as a Korean entertainer from 1986 until 2001, has since come back to Korea and still lives and works in the Itaewon area. So these spaces or areas of entertainment and connection are places that I think are worth studying for scholars of Korea and elsewhere. I also tried to point out to you the diversification and separation of different kinds of non-normative subcultures. So a person like Sekja moves away from being a fairy and becomes a makeup queen. But that doesn't mean that just because you're diversified and you're separated, that you don't have any connections from the community that you left, or you don't necessarily feel a strong connection with. So I gave the example of the Myeongdong fashion designers who became gay capitalists and continued to maintain strong relations with transgender club workers, people like Sekja, Mrs. N, and Mrs. E, who I described in the presentation. Um, There were similar articulations of persistent alienation, both by gay men, fags, and also by transgender women or makeup queens in the context of the HIV and AIDS crisis, a topic that I haven't really provided you with a lot of information about, but which I'm continuing to work on today. And then the last point is to think about the presentation not just as something that happened in the past, but also what kind of historical lessons about how differently marginalized groups today can find common cause against what you might call post-hetero authoritarianism. So authoritarianism officially falls in the 1990s, but the impetus to only be male or female, to present your gender in a certain way, those kinds of pressures have continued well after the 1990s. And across the world today, I should mention, not just in South Korea, but in the United States, my own country, I think the idea of hetero-authoritarianism, where President Trump says there are only two sexes, that this term and concept is actually quite useful for thinking about the politics of LGBT outside of Korea and way past what we originally thought was a democratic transition in the 1990s. But today, we are left thinking, is South Korea going to remain a democracy? Is the United States going to remain a democracy? Is Germany going to remain a democracy? These are all questions up in the air. In the case of Korea, of course, from an authoritarian state and a liberal state and a society that tended to discriminate against gay and transgender people, of course, it was impossible to find official or even social recognition before the 1990s. Now, after the 1990s, the acknowledgement of these kinds of individuals and the benefits that you might gain from your state are increasingly on the rise. But despite the seemingly emancipatory ability of sexual minorities today in South Korea and elsewhere to identify themselves in new ways and to have a number of consumer spaces in which to identify yourself, often online through social media. The conditions and politics of the post 1990s era, the post authoritarian era, have led to increasingly atomized, competitive, and a kind of confrontational culture of despair. So it might be possible to reimagine the process of empowerment from what we might call like a radically queer place of post recognition. That is to say, of course, it's important to be recognized, but if recognition increasingly leads to atomization, competition, and confrontation, um, I'm not sure that that is necessarily the only or the best way of trying to ensure the happiness of all citizens of South Korea. So the kind of phantom-like, ghost-like quality of non-normative livelihood in the 60s and 70s, where people kind of just appeared and then disappeared in and out of spaces, often trying not to be seen and remaining under the radar. I don't want to see this as some kind of something from the past that is not necessary or it's pre-political or it's not related to our present. Instead, I think the stories of Sekta and others provide valuable resources for creating um, relationships between and among groups. So LGBTI is not one community, it's many, many communities, increasingly separated, um, and also separated by age. So I think the stories that I've tried to tell you here might offer some lessons about how we can make connections across generations and across groups as a strategy for ensuring the happiness and livelihood of all individuals. And lastly, I'll just show you this final picture. Now we're sort of past COVID, the COVID era. But when I was finalizing my research, I noticed that this particular community, whose members were kind enough to share their stories with me, that they continued this community well into the present, surviving the pandemic as a laboring community. So here you can see a bazaar or just a stall that was set up in Itaewon. You can see the LGBT flag in the background. Of course, bars and restaurants were the first things that were closed during the pandemic. So how did transgender women survive? They survived through community. So here you can see the many pieces of clothing that they had acquired during their lives as performers, and here they were selling them one by one in order to make enough money in order to survive. So I think these stories of individual communities and of personal and collective survival are extremely important. So thank you so much for listening, and sorry for the long lecture, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.